On the afternoon of July 31, 1940, Generaloberst Franz Halder sat in his office at the headquarters of the Oberkommando des Heers in Fontainebleau, recording in his private diary words that would determine the fate of millions. The room smelled of summer heat and the particular mustiness of French buildings requisitioned for purposes their architects had never imagined. The windows opened to admit air that did little to relieve the oppression of a continental July. Halder was 56 years old, a Bavarian artillery officer whose career had been built on the meticulous staff work that German military tradition considered the foundation of operational success. His face was thin, his manner precise, his handwriting the cramped script of a man accustomed to recording details that others might overlook and that history might later require. The words he wrote that afternoon concerned a decision that Hitler had announced at the Berghof earlier in the day, a decision that Halder's professional judgment recognized as transformative and that his professional discipline required he implement, regardless of that recognition. Hitler had declared that the Soviet Union must be destroyed. The war against Britain, which remained undefeated across the Channel, would continue, but the main effort of German strategy would shift eastward to eliminate the regime that National Socialist ideology considered Germany's ultimate enemy. The invasion would occur in the spring of 1941, would employ the largest military force in history, would accomplish in a single campaign what Napoleon had attempted and failed to achieve. The logic that Hitler presented was strategic rather than purely ideological. Destroying Russia would remove Britain's last potential continental ally, would secure the resources that prolonged war required, would establish the continental hegemony that would make Germany invulnerable to blockade or coalition. The logic was coherent within assumptions that Halder recorded without endorsing and that subsequent events would systematically contradict. The diary that Halder maintained throughout his tenure as Chief of the General Staff would become one of the war's most important documents, a contemporaneous record of decisions and discussions that post-war memory would otherwise obscure or distort. He wrote in a personal shorthand that reflected both security consciousness and the habits of a staff officer accustomed to condensing complex information into forms that reference could later expand. The entry for July 31st captured the moment when the war that Germany was winning became the war that Germany would lose, when a conflict whose scope remained manageable expanded into dimensions that no management could control. Halder understood this, or something like it, even as he recorded the decision that understanding could not influence. The strategic situation that July appeared to validate Hitler's confidence in ways that professional skepticism could not entirely dismiss. France had fallen in 6 weeks, a victory whose speed had exceeded every projection and whose completeness had eliminated the continental opponent that German planning had considered most dangerous. The Allies had been expelled from the continent at Dunkirk, their equipment abandoned on beaches whose images confirmed German dominance of the war's western theater. The Wehrmacht stood victorious from the Arctic to the Pyrenees, its casualties modest by the standards of the previous war, its capabilities seemingly confirmed by achievements that exceeded what the most optimistic assessments had predicted. The professionals who served on Halder's staff recognized what victories obscured, that Britain remained undefeated, that American potential loomed beyond the Atlantic, that resources Germany had captured could not compensate for resources that blockade was progressively denying. The war that appeared won was actually stalemated, its apparent victories having produced a situation that German strategy had no mechanism to resolve. Britain could not be invaded with naval superiority that Germany did not possess and could not achieve. Britain would not negotiate because British leadership had concluded that negotiation meant submission, and that submission was unacceptable, regardless of what military reverses might impose. The strategic problem that confronted Germany in July 1940 was how to convert tactical success into strategic conclusion, how to end a war that victories could not terminate. Hitler's answer was to expand the war rather than conclude it, to seek in the East the decision that the West would not provide. The Soviet Union's destruction would accomplish what Britain's defeat could not be achieved directly, would eliminate the continental power whose potential intervention British strategy might be counting upon, would secure the oil and grain and minerals that German war economy required, would create the autarkic empire that Allied blockade could not strangle. The logic required assumptions about Soviet weakness that intelligence could not confirm and that the campaign would refute, required timelines that logistics could not support and that distances would extend beyond all calculation. Halder recorded the logic and prepared to implement it, his diary preserving the moment when professional duty required him to plan an operation that professional judgment suggested was catastrophic. The strategic logic that produced Hitler's decision reflected calculations whose coherence could not compensate for assumptions whose validity the campaign would destroy. Germany in the summer of 1940 faced a paradox that victory had created rather than resolved. The Wehrmacht had conquered more territory in less time than any army in modern history, yet the war that these conquests were supposed to win remained unfinished. Britain survived behind the Channel, its fleet intact, its air force undefeated, its government committed to continuation that German military power could not prevent. The strategic problem was not how to win battles, but how to convert battles won into wars concluded. And for this problem, the victories of 1940 offered no solution. The options available to German strategy in the summer of 1940 were limited by constraints that triumph had not eliminated. Invasion of Britain required crossing the Channel with forces adequate to defeat the British Army on its home ground, a requirement that naval inferiority made impossible to meet. The Luftwaffe's attempt to establish air superiority as prerequisite to invasion had failed in the Battle of Britain, German losses exceeding replacement rates, while British production and pilot training outpaced attrition. The peripheral strategies that might have pressured Britain indirectly, Mediterranean operations, attacks on imperial communications, economic warfare through submarine campaign, offered possibilities that years might realize, but that immediate decision could not achieve. Germany had won everything except the capacity to end the war that winning was supposed to conclude. Hitler's turn toward the Soviet Union represented his conviction that the Eastern Colossus represented both threat and opportunity, whose conjunction made invasion not merely desirable but necessary. The ideological dimension was genuine. The destruction of Bolshevism had been central to National Socialist purpose since the movement's inception, and the war that racial ideology demanded was war against the Slavic East, whose subjugation would provide the living space that German destiny required. But the decision announced on July 31st was framed in strategic terms rather than ideological fulfillment. The Soviet Union was Britain's last hope on the continent. Destroying it would remove that hope and compel the accommodation that direct assault could not impose. The strategic logic contained assumptions whose examination would have revealed their fragility. The premise that Britain continued fighting because of Soviet potential required believing that British leadership was calculating odds rather than expressing determination, that Churchill's government would negotiate once the continental balance shifted decisively.
The premise ignored what British behavior had already demonstrated, that continuation reflected commitment that circumstances could not alter, that negotiation was excluded, regardless of what the military balance might suggest. Britain would fight because fighting was preferable to submission, would continue because continuation expressed values that defeat could not extinguish. The Soviet factor in British calculations was real, but not determinative. Eliminating it would not produce the British capitulation that elimination was supposed to achieve.
The argument supplemented strategic logic was equally flawed in ways that planning could not acknowledge. The Soviet Union possessed oil in the Caucasus, grain in Ukraine, minerals throughout its vast territory, resources whose capture would theoretically free Germany from the blockade constraints that British sea power imposed. The argument assumed that capture would translate into exploitation, that the infrastructure necessary to extract and transport these resources would survive the campaigns that conquest required, that occupation could achieve production levels that peacetime development had established. The assumptions ignored what military operations would demonstrate, that conquest destroyed the economic assets it was supposed to secure, that occupation consumed resources rather than generating them, that the distances involved exceeded the transportation capacity that German logistics could provide. Halder recorded these strategic discussions with the professional detachment that staff officers cultivated and that personal judgment could not entirely suppress. His diary entries from the summer and autumn of 1940 document a planning process whose participants recognized problems they could not solve and constraints they could not acknowledge. The distances to objectives in the Soviet Union exceeded anything German logistics had previously supported. The Soviet military strength that intelligence estimated was almost certainly understated. The reserves that mobilization could produce unknown and probably unknowable. The timeline that operational success required, victory before winter, before the Soviet state could relocate industry beyond German reach, before attrition accumulated into exhaustion, was demanding in ways that optimistic assumptions could not mitigate. The decision to invade the Soviet Union was not inevitable, but was also not irrational within the framework that produced it. Hitler confronted a strategic situation that available options could not resolve, and chose an option whose risks were enormous, but whose potential rewards seemed commensurate. The choice reflected faith in German military capability that 1940s victories had encouraged, confidence in Soviet weakness that ideological preconceptions reinforced, and willingness to gamble that the alternative, prolonged war against enemies whose resources exceeded Germany's, made attractive by comparison. The gamble would fail, catastrophically and irreversibly. The failure would cost Germany the war, but the decision to attempt it was a decision that the situation's logic could produce, even if that logic rested on foundations that reality would destroy. On the morning of August 5, 1940, General Erich Marcks sat at a desk in the headquarters of the 18th Army in East Prussia, beginning work on a document that would set in motion the destruction of the army he served. The room smelled of pine forests and the particular damp of Baltic summers, the windows admitting air that carried sounds of military activity from the encampments surrounding the headquarters complex. Marcks was 49 years old, a Prussian officer whose career had traced the arc that German military tradition prescribed: staff college, regimental command, positions of increasing responsibility that reflected competence his superiors had consistently recognized. His face was angular, his bearing erect, his manner reflecting the professional confidence of a soldier who had spent 30 decades mastering the craft that circumstances now required him to apply against an opponent of unprecedented scale. The task that Halder had assigned him
was to produce the first operational draft for the invasion of the Soviet Union, a planning document that would translate Hitler's strategic decision into military reality. Marks approached the assignment with the methodical thoroughness that staff training had instilled, assembling maps whose scales revealed distances that previous campaigns had not approached, intelligence assessments whose limitations he recognized without possessing means to overcome, logistical studies whose calculations required assumptions that experience could not validate. The document he would produce, Operations Entwurf Ost, Operation Draft East, would establish the conceptual framework within which subsequent planning would occur, the assumptions that later refinements would modify but not fundamentally challenge. The assumptions that Marx's plan required were assumptions that the campaign would systematically contradict. His assessment of Soviet military capability reflected the consensus that German intelligence had developed and that ideological preconceptions reinforced. The Red Army was large but poorly led, its officer corps decimated by purges whose scale German analysts had documented, its equipment obsolescent, its morale questionable. The defeats that Finland had inflicted during the Winter War of 1939–1940 seemed to confirm this assessment, Soviet forces suffering casualties grotesquely disproportionate to Finnish resistance before mass finally overwhelmed Finnish defenses. Marks calculated that the Wehrmacht would face approximately 150 Soviet divisions in the campaign's opening phase, a number that subsequent intelligence would revise upward without fundamentally altering the planning that the original estimate had shaped.
The distances that Marx's plan addressed exceeded anything German military experience provided reference for. The frontier from which the invasion would launch stretched over 1,000 kilometers from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The depth to which advancing forces would need to penetrate, Moscow alone lay over 1,000 kilometers from the starting positions, exceeded the total distance that the Wehrmacht had covered in conquering France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway combined. The road networks that would support this advance were primitive by Western European standards, their capacity inadequate for the traffic that modern mechanized operations required, their surfaces unsuited to vehicles designed for conditions they would not encounter. Marx noted these factors without resolving the constraints they imposed, his plan requiring solutions that planning alone could not provide. The timeline that operational success demanded was perhaps the most demanding assumption that Marx's draft incorporated. The campaign would need to achieve decisive results before winter imposed conditions that halt offensive operations, before the Soviet state could mobilize reserves whose potential German estimates could not accurately assess, before attrition accumulated into exhaustion that numerical superiority could not overcome. Marx calculated that 9 to 17 weeks would suffice for the campaign's completion, a timeline that assumed rates of advance that logistics would constrain and Soviet resistance would contest. The assumption was not arbitrary, it reflected what 1940s campaigns had demonstrated about Wehrmacht capability, but it applied lessons from one context to circumstances that would prove fundamentally different. The concept that emerged from Marx's analysis proposed a three-axis advance whose convergence would destroy Soviet military power before the Soviet state could adapt to the invasion's challenge. Army Group North would drive toward Leningrad, securing the Baltic flank and eliminating Soviet naval presence in those waters. Army Group Center would advance on Moscow, capturing the capital whose administrative and transportation significance made it the campaign's ultimate objective. Army Group South would seize Ukraine, whose agricultural and industrial resources would serve German war economy once occupation could organize their exploitation. The three thrusts would cooperate in encirclements that would trap and destroy Soviet forces attempting to defend the frontier, replicating at larger scale the operational pattern that had annihilated French armies in 6 weeks.
Marks completed his draft in mid-August and submitted it to Halder for review, his professional obligation discharged through analysis whose thoroughness could not compensate for assumptions whose validity the campaign would test. He would not remain at headquarters to refine the plan his draft had initiated. Subsequent assignment would return him to Field Command, to the Eastern Front, where the consequences of planning would manifest in casualties and destruction whose scale his analysis had not encompassed. The document he produced would evolve through subsequent iterations into Operation Barbarossa, the largest military operation in history, the campaign that would cost Germany the war. The assumptions it required would prove wrong. The timeline it proposed would prove impossible. The victory it promised would prove illusory. Marks had done his professional duty. His profession was preparing to destroy itself. The autumn of 1940 saw Halder's staff transform Marks's draft into the operational plan that would bear the name Barbarossa, a process of refinement that addressed tactical details while preserving strategic assumptions whose validity no refinement could establish. The smell of the underground complex, concrete, recycled air, the particular staleness of spaces designed for survival rather than comfort, became the sensory environment within which Germany's fate was being sealed by men whose professional competence was being applied to purposes that competence could not redeem.
The intelligence picture that guided planning reflected limitations that planners acknowledged in documents whose operational implications they could not address. German assessments of Soviet military strength had improved since Marks' initial draft, but remained fundamentally flawed in ways that ideological assumptions reinforced and that professional analysis could not entirely correct. The Red Army's order of battle was estimated with reasonable accuracy for forces deployed in the Western Soviet Union, but the reserve capacity that mobilization could generate remained unknown because the Soviet mobilization system remained opaque to German intelligence. The factories beyond the Urals that would produce the tanks and aircraft that 1942 and 1943 would deploy were known to exist, but their capacity was systematically underestimated. The assumption that destroying forces in the Western Soviet Union would destroy Soviet military capability reflected a failure to understand what Soviet industrial and demographic depth made possible. Halder's diary entries from this period document a planning process whose participants recognized problems they could not solve. The logistical studies that his staff produced identified constraints that operational ambition systematically exceeded, the railroad gauge difference that would require conversion of Soviet lines before German trains could use them, the road network inadequacy that would limit motor transport to fractions of required capacity, the fuel consumption rates that would outpace supply capabilities within weeks of the campaign's opening. Each study identified problems. None identified solutions adequate to the problems identified. The planning proceeded anyway because the decision to invade had been made and because planning's purpose was implementation rather than evaluation. The distance to Moscow, the objective whose capture Marks had designated as decisive, was approximately 1,100 kilometers from the assembly areas where German forces would concentrate. The distance exceeded what German logistics had previously supported by factors that no organizational improvement could overcome. A German infantry division on the march consumed approximately 300 tons of supplies daily: food, ammunition, fuel, fodder for the horses that German logistics still relied upon. Multiplying this consumption across the 150 divisions that Barbarossa would employ produced requirements that the Soviet transportation network could not support and that German motor transport could not replace. The calculations were performed, the implications were noted, the planning continued. The timeline that Barbarossa's planning established reflected optimism that experience encouraged, but that circumstances would not reward.
The campaign would begin in mid-May 1941, allowing maximum time before autumn rains transformed roads into mud and winter cold halted operations entirely. The assumption was that decisive victory would be achieved within 4 months, that Soviet resistance would collapse, as French resistance had collapsed once the initial battles were lost, that Moscow's capture would produce the political disintegration that military victory required. The assumption drew upon the precedent of 1940 without acknowledging that the precedent's applicability was precisely what the campaign would test and what the campaign's failure would disprove. Halder's diary entries from this period document a planning process whose participants recognized problems they could not solve. The logistical studies that his staff produced identified constraints that operational ambition could not overcome, problems that solutions could not solve, assumptions that evidence contradicted but that the planning process could not abandon. The warnings were not suppressed or ignored in any simple sense. They were acknowledged, recorded, and set aside because the system that produced them could not translate acknowledgement into decisions that acknowledgement should have informed. The final plan that emerged bore Halder's professional stamp in its operational sophistication and its logistical optimism. 3 army groups would advance on diverging axes whose cooperation would produce encirclements that would destroy Soviet forces faster than replacement could restore them. The timetable assumed rates of advance that would outpace Soviet reaction, would capture objectives before defenders could organize, would achieve the decision that strategic logic required before conditions imposed the pause that decision required avoiding. The plan was professional in its construction and catastrophic in its assumptions. The professionalism could not redeem the catastrophe. The catastrophe would consume the professionals who had planned it, the soldiers who would execute it, and the nation whose fate depended on an outcome that planning had made impossible. The warnings that professional analysis produced accumulated through the winter of 1940-1941 in documents whose conclusions planning incorporated without permitting them to alter decisions that planning was designed to implement. Halder's staff identified constraints that operational ambition could not overcome, problems that solutions could not solve, assumptions that evidence contradicted but that the planning process could not abandon. The warnings were not suppressed or ignored in any simple sense. They were acknowledged, recorded, and set aside because the system that produced them could not translate acknowledgement into decisions that acknowledgement should have informed.
The logistical assessments that Halder reviewed were devastating in their implications for those who read them with attention that conclusions demanded. General Eduard Wagner, the quartermaster general responsible for supply planning, produced studies demonstrating that German motor transport could sustain offensive operations to a depth of approximately 500 kilometers from railheads, less than half the distance to Moscow, barely adequate to reach Smolensk, insufficient for the campaign's decisive phase. The railroad conversion that would extend German logistics deeper into Soviet territory would require time that operational tempo could not provide, equipment that German industry could not produce in adequate quantities, labor that occupation would need to conscript from populations whose cooperation could not be assumed. Wagner's studies proposed solutions that were actually admissions that solutions did not exist. The campaign would proceed in phases, each phase pausing while logistics caught up with operations, each pause providing time for Soviet forces to reorganize and Soviet reserves to mobilize. The phased approach contradicted the operational concept that Barbarossa embodied, the rapid, continuous advance that would destroy Soviet military power before the Soviet state could adapt. The logistics that made phased advance necessary were the same logistics that meant continuous advance impossible, the same logistics that meant the campaign could not achieve its objectives within the timeline that objectives required. Wagner documented this contradiction. The planning proceeded anyway.
The intelligence assessments that accumulated alongside logistical studies identified Soviet military assets whose existence planning acknowledged and whose implications planning could not address. The Red Army was larger than initial estimates had suggested, its divisions more numerous, its equipment more modern, its reserve capacity more substantial. The T-34 tank that German intelligence had identified was superior to German armor in ways that encounter would confirm and that planning had not incorporated. The Soviet aircraft industry was producing modern fighters and bombers at rates that German estimates systematically understated. Each intelligence revision increased the challenge that Barbarossa would face without decreasing the confidence that Barbarossa would succeed. Halder's diary entries from this period reflect a man whose professional training required him to note what his professional position prevented him from acting upon. He recorded the logistical constraints that Wagner identified, the intelligence revisions that accumulating information produced, the timeline pressures that seasonal factors imposed. He did not record objections to the enterprise itself, did not document advocacy for alternatives that objection might have suggested, did not preserve evidence of opposition that opposition's futility might explain. The Chief of the General Staff planned the operation whose assumptions he recorded without endorsement, implementing decisions whose wisdom his documentation implicitly questioned. The date that planning established for Barbarossa's launch, May 15, 1941, was postponed by circumstances that planning had not anticipated and that postponement would make more damaging. The Balkan campaign that German intervention in Yugoslavia and Greece required diverted forces and consumed time that the Eastern timeline could not spare, pushing the invasion's start date into late June and compressing the window within which decisive results would need to be achieved. The postponement was approximately 5 weeks, 5 weeks that summer's end would subtract from the campaign's duration, 5 weeks that autumn's arrival would impose as constraint that the original timeline had not included. The warnings that planning had produced became more acute as the time available to ignore them diminished. The final directive for Operation Barbarossa, issued on December 18, 1940, established objectives whose achievement the directive's supporting studies had demonstrated was impossible. The Wehrmacht would destroy Soviet forces in Western Russia through encirclement battles that would prevent retreat into the interior. The advance would continue to a line running from Archangel to Astrakhan, a depth of over 1,500 kilometers that logistics could not support and that distances made unreachable within any timeline that seasonal constraints permitted. The directive was operationally sophisticated in its conception and strategically delusional in its expectations, professional in its language, and catastrophic in its requirements. Halder signed the orders that implemented the directive with the professional discipline that signing required and that his diary suggests he maintained without conviction that professional judgment could support. The warnings had been produced, the warnings had been noted, the warnings had changed nothing, because the system that produced them could not incorporate their conclusions into decisions that their conclusions should have influenced. The largest military operation in history would proceed on assumptions that professional analysis had demonstrated were false, towards objectives that professional calculation had demonstrated were unreachable, within timelines that professional assessment had demonstrated were impossible. The professionals had done their work. Their work would destroy them.
Erich Marcks experienced the campaign his plan had initiated from the perspective that field command provided and that staff work had not encompassed. He had returned to troop duty before Barbarossa's launch, commanding the 101st Light Division in Army Group South's advance through Ukraine, leading men whose fates his planning had helped determine and whose experience would teach him what planning had not revealed. The Eastern Front that he encountered in June 1941 contradicted the assumptions that his August 1940 draft had required, the distances longer than maps had suggested, the resistance stronger than intelligence had indicated.
the logistics more fragile than calculations had projected. The advance through Ukraine proceeded more slowly than operational timelines had prescribed, Soviet forces contesting ground that planning had assumed would be yielded, defensive positions requiring reduction that schedules had not allocated time to accomplish. Marks pushed his division forward according to orders whose urgency reflected awareness that time was the resource the campaign could least afford to waste, his vehicles consuming fuel at rates that supply could not sustain, his infantry marching distances that accumulated into exhaustion that rest could not adequately restore. The smell of the Ukrainian steppe in summer, dust, sunflowers, the particular dryness of continental heat became the sensory environment within which his understanding of his own plan's inadequacy progressively developed. The wounding came on June 26, less than a week after the campaign began, an artillery shell whose fragments struck Marks with force that his position near the front had made possible and that his professional obligations had made necessary. The wound was severe, his left leg shattered beyond repair, requiring amputation that field surgery performed under conditions that peacetime medicine would have considered primitive. The general who had drafted the invasion's first operational concept was removed from the invasion's execution within days of its commencement, his body bearing damage that the campaign would inflict on hundreds of thousands of others whose planning roles had been less central but whose suffering would be equivalent. The convalescence that followed provided time for reflection that operational command had not permitted and that the campaign's trajectory made increasingly somber. Marks followed Barbarossa's progress from hospital beds in Germany, reading reports whose optimism he could now assess against experience that optimism had contradicted, watching the advance that his plan had initiated encounter obstacles that his plan had not adequately addressed. The encirclements that operations achieved were enormous. Kiev alone captured over 600,000 Soviet prisoners, yet the Soviet state did not collapse as French collapse had suggested it would, the reserves that German planning had not accounted for materializing in quantities that replacement should not have been possible. The timeline that his original draft had proposed, 9 to 17 weeks for the campaign's completion, passed without the completion that the timeline had promised. September arrived with German forces still hundreds of kilometers from Moscow, their strength degraded by casualties and mechanical attrition, their logistics stretched beyond the breaking point that Wagner's studies had identified. October brought the autumn rains that transformed roads into mud that immobilized vehicles and slowed advances to rates that infantry on foot could barely exceed. November brought the cold that his planning had assumed the campaign would avoid, temperatures dropping toward levels that German equipment and German soldiers were not prepared to endure. The professional assessment that Marks developed during his recovery incorporated recognition that professional analysis could not publicly acknowledge. The plan he had drafted had been fundamentally flawed, not in its operational conception, but in its strategic assumptions, the assumptions about Soviet weakness that ideology had encouraged and that the campaign was disproving, the assumptions about German logistics that optimism had sustained and that distances were destroying, the timeline that his experience had suggested and that circumstances were contradicting. The campaign was not failing because execution had been inadequate. It was failing because the enterprise had been impossible, because no execution could have achieved what the assumptions required, because professional competence had been applied to purposes that competence could not accomplish.
Marks returned to duty in early 1942, his wooden leg a permanent reminder of the campaign whose consequences continued accumulating, his professional obligations requiring him to serve a military enterprise whose trajectory his planning had helped establish and whose outcome his experience had taught him to anticipate. The Eastern Front that he rejoined was different from the front he had left, larger, more brutal, more obviously stalemated in ways that 1941's optimism had not contemplated. The Wehrmacht that had invaded expecting quick victory was now fighting for objectives that quick victory had not achieved, consuming strength that quick victory would have preserved, dying in numbers that quick victory would have prevented. The recognition that the war was lost, that the decision to invade the Soviet Union had transformed a war Germany was winning into a war Germany could not win, was not something that Marx could articulate through channels that articulation might have influenced. The system that employed him could not incorporate conclusions that conclusions would have required acknowledging, could not process assessments whose implications contradicted purposes that the system existed to serve. He continued his duty with the professionalism that duty required, commanding formations whose destruction the campaign was progressively accomplishing, serving a cause whose failure his planning had helped ensure, and whose continuation his service helped perpetuate. Halder's tenure as Chief of the General Staff extended through the campaign's first year and into the second, his professional position requiring him to manage operations whose trajectory his professional judgment had recognized as catastrophic, and whose continuation his professional obligations demanded he support. The diary he maintained through this period documents a progressive deterioration of German strategic position, of the relationship between military professionals and political leadership, of Halder's own capacity to sustain the contradictions that his role imposed. The entries grow terser as 1942 advances, the meticulous detail of earlier volumes giving way to fragments whose brevity suggests exhaustion that elaboration could not relieve. The arguments with Hitler that punctuated Halder's final months in office reflected disagreements whose substance could not be reconciled and whose expression could not alter outcomes that disagreement addressed. Hitler insisted on objectives that available forces could not achieve, demanded advances that logistics could not support, prohibited withdrawals that tactical situations required. Halder advocated the professional positions that his training prescribed, concentration of force, economy of effort, the flexibility that operational circumstances demanded. The advocacy changed nothing because the system that employed him had been designed to implement decisions rather than influence them, to translate political will into military action rather than to subject political will to military assessment. The Eastern Front that Halder managed through the summer of 1942 was consuming German strength at rates that no victory could justify, and that continuation could only accelerate. The advance toward Stalingrad and the Caucasus that Hitler had ordered was stretching German forces across distances that defensive requirements could not cover, creating vulnerabilities that Soviet commanders would eventually exploit. Halder recognized these vulnerabilities, documented them in appreciations whose conclusions reached Hitler without producing responses that conclusions warranted. The professional soldier, whose professional duty was to provide military advice, was providing advice that political leadership systematically rejected, while requiring him to implement decisions that rejection produced. The dismissal came on September 24, 1942, less than 2 months before the Soviet counteroffensive that would encircle the Sixth Army at Stalingrad and confirm everything that Halder's professional judgment had anticipated. Hitler relieved him with explanations that blamed professional timidity for failures that political decisions had produced, accused him of lacking the aggressive spirit that National Socialist leadership demanded, dismissed the military expertise that his career represented as inadequate to requirements that ideology defined. Halder departed his position with the knowledge that the catastrophe he had foreseen was approaching, and that his departure could not prevent what his presence had been unable to influence.
The years that followed his dismissal carried Halder through experiences that his staff officer's career had not prepared him to anticipate. He was arrested after the July 20, 1944 assassination attempt against Hitler, not because he had participated in the plot, but because his known skepticism made him suspect in a regime that could no longer distinguish professional disagreement from treason. The concentration camps that received him, Flossenburg, then Dachau, subjected him to conditions that his general's rank could not mitigate, and that survival required him to endure. The war, whose planning he had directed, ended with him a prisoner of the regime he had served, his liberation coming from American forces whose victory his planning had been designed to prevent. The professional assessment that Halder could finally articulate after liberation confirmed what his diary had documented throughout. The decision to invade the Soviet Union had been the decision that cost Germany the war, the strategic gamble whose failure had transformed a conflict Germany was winning into a conflict Germany could not survive. The assumptions that planning had required, Soviet weakness, German logistical adequacy, timeline sufficiency, had been assumptions that reality had systematically disproved. The professional objections that staff work had produced had been objections that the command system could not incorporate, warnings that the decision-making structure could not translate into decisions that warnings should have informed. His retrospective clarity that Halder could now provide confirmed the war's turning point with precision that contemporaneous uncertainty had obscured. The decision announced on July 31, 1940, the decision to destroy the Soviet Union, had been the decision from which all subsequent catastrophe flowed. The campaigns that followed, the battles that consumed millions, the destruction that reshaped continents, all of it traced to that afternoon at the Berghof, when Hitler declared intentions that Halder had recorded in his diary and that his professional judgment had recognized as transformative. The transformation had been accomplished. The transformation had been catastrophic. The professional soldier who had planned it and opposed it and implemented it and survived it could now explain what explanation could not redeem. The war's final years carried both men toward conclusions that the decision of July 1940 had set in motion and that no subsequent decision could avert. Halder survived his imprisonment to witness Germany's destruction from within the system that had produced it, his liberation in April 1945 coming from forces whose victory validated the professional judgment that his service had required him to subordinate. Marcks did not survive. His fate was sealed on a Norman beach where the consequences of the Eastern gamble manifested in the Western invasion that the gamble's failure had made possible. Marcks had been assigned command of the 84th Corps, defending the Normandy coast, his experience and his wooden leg, both testaments to the campaign whose planning he had initiated and whose failure had determined everything that followed. The forces he commanded on June 6, 1944, were inadequate to the task that defending against invasion required. Inadequate because the Eastern Front consumed resources that Western defense demanded, because the decision to invade Russia had created the two-front war that German strategy had always sought to avoid, because the gamble that was supposed to end the war instead had ensured that the war would end Germany. The morning of June 12th found Marcks traveling by vehicle near Saint-Lô, inspecting positions whose weakness he understood better than the headquarters that issued orders he could not fulfill. The smell of Norman hedgerows and the sound of distant combat surrounded him as his car moved through terrain that would soon become the graveyard of German forces in the West. The Allied aircraft that appeared overhead represented the air supremacy that the Eastern Campaign had made possible by consuming the Luftwaffe in a theater whose demands exceeded what German production could sustain. The strafing run that struck his vehicle killed him instantly, the general who had drafted Operation Draft East dying in the operation that Draft East's failure had enabled. Halder learned of Marx's death through channels that the war's chaos intermittently provided, another name added to the roster of professionals whose expertise had been employed in service of decisions that expertise had recognized as catastrophic. The man who had produced the first plan for invading the Soviet Union had been killed by consequences that the invasion's failure had produced, an irony whose recognition could provide no comfort and whose meaning the war's continuation would underscore with casualties that continued accumulating until accumulation finally ceased. The post-war decades allowed Halder opportunities for reflection that wartime had precluded and that survival had made possible. He settled in Bavaria, the region of his birth, living quietly while contributing to historical projects whose purposes included ensuring that the record he had preserved would inform understanding that record alone could provide. The diary that he had maintained throughout his tenure as Chief of the General Staff became a foundational document for historians examining how the decision to invade the Soviet Union had been made, how warnings had been produced and ignored, how professional judgment had been subordinated to political will in ways that professional judgment had correctly predicted would prove catastrophic. His testimony to American historians documented what his diary had recorded, the strategic logic that had seemed compelling in July 1940, the planning process that had identified problems without solving them, the warnings that had accumulated without producing decisions that warnings should have informed. The decision to invade the Soviet Union was the war's turning point, the moment when a conflict whose outcome remained uncertain became a conflict whose outcome was determined. Everything that followed, Stalingrad, Kursk, the destruction of Army Group Center, the defense of Normandy, the final collapse, flowed from that decision with a necessity that hindsight revealed and that foresight had suggested but could not prevent. Halder died on April 2, 1972, in Aschau im Chiemgau, Bavaria, at the age of 87. His passing received notice in publications whose readership included those who studied the war professionally and those who remembered it personally, his obituaries noting the positions he had held and the documents he had preserved, without resolving the moral complexities that service to the Nazi regime permanently attached to his record. The diary that constituted his most significant legacy remained available for scholars whose interest in understanding how catastrophic decisions were made found in its pages evidence that other sources could not provide.
Marcks had died 28 years earlier, his grave in France marking the resting place of a soldier whose professional competence had been employed in service of purposes that competence could not redeem. The plan he had drafted in August 1940 had evolved into Operation Barbarossa, had consumed millions of lives across 4 years of warfare, had destroyed the army he served and the nation that army defended. His contribution to this destruction had been professional rather than political, technical rather than ideological, but the distinction provided no absolution and changed nothing about outcomes that his planning had helped produce. The strategic gamble that Hitler announced on July 31, 1940, cost Germany the war because the assumptions it required were assumptions that reality would not support. The Soviet Union did not collapse when its Western armies were destroyed. The resources that conquest was supposed to secure could not be exploited at rates that war economy required. The timeline that victory demanded could not be achieved within constraints that logistics and climate imposed. The warnings that professionals produced were warnings that the system could not incorporate into decisions that warnings should have influenced. The gamble failed because it was a gamble, because its success required conditions that could not be guaranteed and that events would not provide. Halder had planned the operation and opposed it and implemented it and survived it. Marcks had conceived its first draft and fought in it and been maimed by it and been killed by its consequences. Both men were professionals whose professionalism had been employed in service of decisions that professionalism had recognized as flawed and could not prevent. Their fates, one surviving to document what had happened, one dying before documentation could be completed, illustrated the arbitrary distribution of consequences that the decision of July 1940 had set in motion.
The decision had cost Germany the war. The cost had been paid by millions whose individual fates, like those of Halder and Marks, had been determined by choices they had not made and could not influence, by a gamble whose failure was their destruction, and whose success, had it somehow been achieved, would have been their destruction in different form. The war that Germany lost was lost because Germany chose to fight it on terms that losing was inevitable. The decision to invade the Soviet Union was that choice, the moment when strategic possibility narrowed to strategic necessity, when the war that might have been won became the war that could not be. Halder recorded that moment in his diary on July 31, 1940. Marks translated it into operational planning in August 1940. The millions who died in the years that followed paid for what that moment had set in motion. The lesson that their deaths might teach, that strategic gambles whose assumptions cannot be verified are gambles whose failure destroys those who undertake them, remained available for those whose attention to history might prevent its repetition. Whether attention would be paid was a question that the dead could not answer, and that the living would determine through choices whose consequences they could not foresee, just as Halder and Marks had not foreseen what the choice of July 1940 would cost them and the world they helped to destroy.